Good evening, I'm Adrienne Arsenault. Tonight, rejecting advice to try trading Meng for the Michaels.
So I respect these individuals, but they're wrong in their approach.
An emphatic Prime Minister at issue is here.
I'm Andrew Chang. Also tonight, COVID-19's brutal U.S. bounce.
I think people just don't care anymore.
The 3 most populous states slammed.
This will lead to real change now.
You got to be kidding me.
The politics of defunding the police.
And Vince Carter makes his NBA retirement official.
His imprint is still all over it.
How he changed the face of basketball in Canada. This is The National.
Justin Trudeau is shutting down any thought that he might bow to mounting pressure and end the extradition case of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou.
Those who asked him to do it hoped it would prompt China to free Canada's 2 Michaels, but the Prime Minister says it's too risky.
Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor have been detained in China for a year and a half now, picked up just after Canada arrested Meng at the request of the United States. As her case drags on, the Michaels wait behind bars, now charged with spying. Trudeau today was sympathetic, but said intervening in Meng's case would put more Canadians at risk. Catherine Cullen with more, including reaction from Kovrig's wife.
Randomly arresting Canadians doesn't give you leverage over the government of Canada anywhere in the world.
The Prime Minister didn't just close the door, he slammed it shut, saying no to the prospect of releasing Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou from her extradition process in hopes that China would release imprisoned Canadians Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. Justin Trudeau was responding to a letter from 19 prominent Canadians, including former Foreign Affairs Ministers Lawrence Cannon and Lloyd Axworthy. It says the 2 Michaels are in conditions tantamount to torture and that it is in Canada's best interests to end the Meng extradition proceeding and to bring the 2 Michaels home.
So I respect these individuals, but they're wrong in their approach.
The Prime Minister said such a move could endanger millions of Canadians.
If countries around the world, including China, realize that by arbitrarily arresting random Canadians, they can get what they want out of Canada politically, well, that makes an awful lot more Canadians who travel around the world vulnerable to that kind of pressure.
Kovrig's wife acknowledges there are challenges, but asks, what's the alternative?
There is no easy solution here. There's not a solution that will satisfy everyone and will cost nothing. The question really then becomes, who has to pay the highest price? And currently, our Michael and Michael Spavor are paying that price.
The Conservative leader is among those calling for a different approach to get the 2 men released, like sanctions on Chinese officials.
Justin Trudeau needs to stop his policy of appeasement, stand up for Canada, improve our situation, give us more leverage.
The Prime Minister did leave the door open to sanctions or cracking down on visas. Still, it's been 563 days since the 2 Michaels were arrested, and there is no clear end in sight. Catherine Cullen, CBC News, Ottawa.
Well, many countries, including Canada, are moving out of the first wave of COVID-19, reopening tentatively with eyes on testing, tracing, and containing the virus. But it is now clear the U.S. is on a different and dangerous path. If you think back, restrictions came late, and it was early April when most states were in some form of lockdown. There was progress. The daily rate of cases began to slowly trend downward, but by mid-May, most states had already begun to reopen. Then, about 10 days ago, the rate of new cases began trending up. The country back to where it was months ago. About half of those new cases are coming from 3 states, California, Florida, and Texas, where, as Stephen D'Souza explains, the problem now is that officials have run out of options.
In Houston, a major children's hospital is now admitting adults. Others are canceling elective surgeries to boost capacity as coronavirus cases surge.
The spread of COVID-19 is real in the state of Texas.
For the 3rd straight day, Texas set a record for new cases, the governor pausing reopening while stopping short of reimposing restrictions.
The best thing that you can do is to just stay at home.
California also set a record for new cases this week, while Arizona announced more than 3,000 new cases today, as hospitalizations there reached record numbers.
The time for prevention measures was a month ago. Now,
The wheels are coming off.
Experts say a combination of early openings, large gatherings, and lax attitudes is helping fuel the surge.
I think people just don't care anymore, honestly. I really don't.
Another issue, a climate where masks are political. Florida is also setting records for new cases, so mayors are doing what governors won't.
If we don't want to go backwards, the only option that we have right now is to order masks in public.
The U.S. president continues to argue that the explanation for the surge is simple.
If we didn't test, we wouldn't have cases. But we have cases because we test. Deaths are down.
But in some areas, the rate of positive results is rising faster, along with hospitalizations. As for the death rate,
if you're going to die, it takes some time for that to happen. So the fact that deaths haven't peaked isn't necessarily a source of comfort.
The solution for some states, another lockdown.
Houston has only 6% of its ICU beds left. So it's necessary to lock down, but there's no longer the will to do that. I think that's going to be the scariest part of what happens next.
The challenges and cases are mounting, as some states that escaped the initial hit from the coronavirus now brace for its full impact. Stephen D'Souza, CBC News, New York.
Now, the U.S. border with Canada is closed to all non-essential travel until at least July 21st. The COVID-19 situation here radically different. Canada today found more than 380 new cases of coronavirus. For reference, during the worst days, that number was closer to 1,700. Canada added 22 new COVID-19 deaths today. The total, now more than 8,550. As it's well known now, about 80% of those deaths have been linked to long-term care homes. According to a new report from the Canadian Institute for Health Information, that proportion is unusual, even abysmal, worse than the United States and many wealthy countries of the OECD. And as David Common shows us, it didn't have to be this way.
I would like everyone to turn towards Orchard Villa while we observe a moment of silence.
Canada is frugal among rich nations, spending a third less than others on long-term care. And when COVID hit, the doors were effectively closed to protect against community spread. That's kept Canada's infection rate relatively low, but it amplifies the death rate inside our nursing homes. Stacked up against other countries in the study, nowhere else had such a high proportion of deaths in long-term care.
I think what the story is telling us is that Canada's system of long-term care is so weak.
The report zeroes in on Canada's early response. Ontario and Quebec, for instance, issued stay-at-home orders and increased funding for hospitals, much less than what other countries did much sooner. Israel, Belgium, even Italy restricted visitors to care homes. Hungary, Ireland, and the Netherlands did that and surged more staff and PPE into the facilities. Austria and Australia did that and tested virtually every resident and staffer early.
This is an example where delays by weeks of implementing key policies that BC did early on, that the evidence was telling us we need to do, that I think led to needless numbers of outbreaks and needless numbers of deaths.
It is them who have failed to support our seniors.
That's about as close as the Prime Minister has come to laying blame for the failures in long-term care, opening the door once again to a role for Ottawa.
Do we need national standards, or do the provinces just need to increase their standards?
If not for those now in care, think just 10 years from now when 1 in 4 Canadians will be over 65, and demand goes up even more. David Common, CBC News, Toronto.
Now, the pandemic put many aspects of life on hold. Some of those delays had life and death consequences too, like screening for cancer. But there were other healthcare interruptions as well, including for elective surgeries, tests, and other procedures. Vicodopia looks at the enormous cost some have paid.
When doctors found tumors in Jasmine Yang in mid-March, her family says there was no option.
The proposal was to have the surgery right then and there.
But then non-emergency surgeries were postponed in BC. Days turned into weeks.
We felt so powerless. We felt there's nothing that we can do to help her and to help to save her.
She was finally scheduled for surgery on May 4th. By then, it was too late. She had died 2 days earlier.
My mom passed away on May 2nd. The system let us down.
The wait for tests and procedures has been stressful for patients and their doctors.
And the person is left wondering, would an earlier diagnosis have made a difference? Much of the time, it may not. But the fact is, we can't be certain of that. So I think fallout like this is something we will only be able to measure in retrospect.
Hospitals across Canada are gearing up to do more procedures and surgeries. In British Columbia, the government estimates it could take up to 2 years to clear its backlog. Others say it's too soon to say, given uncertainty over OR time, PPE, drug supplies, and staff.
Those people are getting tired, so we just don't have the staff to staff the operating room and to do the gastroscopy and the colonoscopy and all those follow-up.
There are also risks in resuming surgeries too soon. This study followed the fate of patients in 24 countries who had surgery while sick with COVID or became infected shortly after. About 1 in 4 people died within a month, and more than half developed breathing problems.
Those are astounding numbers. Now, need to think about how to protect our surgical patients from COVID, and if they have COVID, to find ways to delay their surgery until COVID has passed.
Yet with delays come other risks, some that are too big to bear. Vic Adopia, CBC News, Toronto.
Well, the federal government has announced new help for students.
If we want to build a strong and resilient economy, we have to invest in the next generation.
They can now earn up to $5,000 this summer for volunteer service. Eligible work includes tutoring, translation, and mask making.
The company failed to properly protect the information that they have about all of us.
Lab testing company Life Labs has been ordered to improve its security. Last December, a massive data breach exposed millions in BC and Ontario, prompting an investigation by privacy officials. Details of the investigation are not public.
And a funeral was held today in Brampton, Ontario for a woman and her 3 young daughters. They were killed in a car crash last week. The 20-year-old driver of the car that caused the crash is now facing multiple charges. And calls to defund the police have grown since the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. That is a cry heard in this country as well. Well, today, Toronto Mayor John Tory proposed a plan he calls detasking, and critics on all sides were quick to weigh in. Dave Seglins explains.
Calls for systemic change have been getting louder.
Justice for who?
Across Canada this past month, 4 people in mental distress have died in encounters with police. A CBC News investigation found that since 2000, hundreds of Canadians have died in those encounters. 70% had mental health or addiction issues. Overrepresented among them, Black and Indigenous people. Today, some action.
This will lead to real change now.
Toronto's mayor tabled a proposal to overhaul the $1.2 billion police budget, to equip officers with body cameras, and to shift money to unarmed medical responders, as well as anti-poverty and anti-racism programs.
Now, finally, the world spotlight is on policing, and people do not like what they see.
Instead of defunding, they're calling it detasking police.
In a mental health response, could a mental health nurse and 1 officer be the first responders? Does it really need to be 2 or 5 or 8, however many officers that go there first?
Ontario's premier, whose government would have to approve some of the changes, says no way.
You got to be kidding me. Let's increase funding for areas of community outreach. Building better relationships with communities. I do not believe in cutting police budgets. Simple as that.
But critics say Tory's plan lacks specifics on where police money will be spent.
I mean, what we're seeing is a lot of obfuscating of the truth. We're not seeing a really clear direction of what it is that they're planning on doing, and this is part of a strategy to try to push this off until people forget about it or until it's out of the news cycle.
The motion.
City Council debates the plan next week alongside another motion by some politicians who want the police budget cut by a firm 10% to ensure, they say, changes actually happen. Dave Seglin, CBC News, Toronto.
Wendy Mesley and the CBC say she, the host of The Weekly, used offensive language on 2 occasions during editorial meetings. A spokesperson says she did so last fall while discussing a book title, and then again more recently in preparation for a piece on anti-racism. Disciplinary action has been taken, though management wouldn't say what exactly. Today, Mesley posted new details on Twitter and said, "I hurt my colleagues, my team, and the CBC. For that, I am deeply sorry and ashamed."
A late development to bring you tonight in a story we've been following for weeks. The Canadian Museum for Human Rights says its CEO and president, John Young, is leaving his post immediately. It comes as the museum is once again accused of failing to defend rights, including those of its employees, for the third time in 3 weeks. Austin Grabish has the CBC News exclusive.
A dark sky above the Canadian Museum for Human Rights and a storm brewing inside. 5 women tell CBC News they've been sexually harassed by the same male colleague. This former staffer says she and another woman went to HR after the man made an inappropriate comment.
When we sat down with HR, with the head of HR, after narrating the incident, she turns around and asks her, "Are you sure you didn't do anything?" so that he would say that.
The women say after they complained, nothing changed. They allege the man who works with the public at the museum has grabbed and touched staff, stared at their genital areas, and made inappropriate comments. This current employee says she's been harassed and describes what she's seen him do. We're protecting her identity because she fears reprisals for speaking out. These are her words, not her voice.
Usually being close to them when they're still new in the institution, they have just been hired, looking at them in very inappropriate ways, touching them, feeling like he can do that.
The museum has been embroiled in controversy for 3 weeks. Former employees have called out instances of racism they say they faced inside. And last week, CBC News revealed that management would sometimes agree to not show LGBT content to certain tour groups. The current employee hopes change will come.
It's like you're in shock because when people are bullying you, someone is sexually harassing you, like how come these people cannot understand that you're working in a place where you're promoting rights for everyone, human rights?
The museum confirms in the past it has hired 2 different lawyers to investigate allegations of sexual harassment. Now the museum's hired another lawyer to investigate discrimination in the workplace. Austin Grabish, CBC News, Winnipeg.
Well, there are calls tonight for Alberta Premier Jason Kenney to fire a speechwriter. It's for a column he wrote 7 years ago in which he downplayed the damage done to Indigenous people in residential schools. Aaron Collins has reaction from the Premier and also an Indigenous leader named in that column.
Canada's residential schools, a troubling relic of the past, but front and center today in Alberta's legislature.
The Premier must address the profoundly racist views of his speechwriter, who called the residential schools experience of Indigenous people a, quote, bogus genocide story.
That speechwriter, Paul Bunner. The opposition wants him fired for an article he wrote in 2013. In it, Bunner defends residential schools, arguing that the concept of cultural genocide could create violent insurgencies, calling settlements with survivors perverse financial incentives, and doubting that trauma caused by residential schools is passed on, saying it defies human experience. Alberta's Premier says he disagrees with the article but is standing by its author.
I imagine that somebody who's a journalist for 40 years will have written things that that I disagree with, that I and others may find offensive.
Keeping that speechwriter a problem, according to the former national chief of the Assembly of First Nations, who's personally targeted in the article.
Am I disappointed? Of course. I think anyone that believes in fairness and justice for all people will be extremely disappointed.
Well, this expert says the real problem is that the ideas expressed in the article reflect the feelings of thousands of Canadians.
We're making essentially the suffering of Indigenous people a matter of debate, and that in itself is truly horrendous.
Canada's last residential school closed little more than 2 decades ago, a fresh wound yet to heal, torn open again by the words of a speechwriter and those that stand with him. Aaron Collins, CBC News, Calgary.
Well, people across the country say they've been scammed by a puppy breeding imposter.
People would call me and they say, "Where's my dog? I've been waiting here for 2 hours."
Up next, how it works and what to watch out for.
Plus, the pressure on Ottawa heats up as the Prime Minister digs in over Meng Wanzhou. It's a good night for At Issue.
And he inspired a generation of Canadian basketball players.
And here is Vince Carter with his first stop.
Vince Carter leaves the court. We're back in 2.
People across Canada say they've been scammed out of hundreds of dollars after trying to buy a puppy online, and they are pointing the finger at one woman in particular. As Jen White tells us, they allege she impersonated legitimate breeders.
In February, Elizabeth Halpin posted an ad on Kijiji for a Chinese Shar-Pei puppy. The Langley, BC resident got a text from a Helen Pasha in nearby Vernon. She sent pictures and her Canadian Kennel Club registration.
I called the CKC and it was in fact a valid certificate. I thought, okay, this seems legitimate.
But after Halpin sent a $500 deposit, silence. She then discovered the real Helen Pasha breeds French bulldogs in Quebec.
It just really made me feel like just really stupid and embarrassed. I'm 25 with all this technology at my fingers.
Days later, Halpin got another reply, a breeder from Kelowna named Natalie Lenstra. She sent a long ID that sent up red flags. The real Natalie Lenstra is a Pomeranian breeder in Ontario.
People would call me and they say, "Where's my dog? I've been waiting here for 2 hours." And we drove for 3.5 hours. This went on for months.
Lenstra says she has spoken with 35 people who say they lost between $150 to $700 each. Multiple scam victims that spoke with CBC News allege that Brittany Osborne is responsible. She's a 25-year-old resident of Harbour Grace, an hour from St. John's. Osborne has 2 past fraud convictions. She's due back in court in August on unrelated charges, including extortion. Meanwhile, no charges have been laid in these cases. The RCMP says it's still investigating. In a voicemail response to CBC News, Osborne said some scam allegations against her are true, while some are false.
I'm struggling from mental health addiction for a very long time. My addiction has made me turn to scams.
She did not respond to follow-up requests for an interview.
Good girl.
In the end, Elizabeth Halpin did get a dog, a rescue, and the breed she was looking for. Jen White, CBC News, St. John's.
Well, some other stories we are following. Vancouver is out of the running as a hub city for the NHL's return. Late tonight, the Canucks issued a statement confirming the city would not be hosting games once the season returns. That leaves Toronto and Edmonton as the lone Canadian cities still in contention, with Las Vegas, Los Angeles, and Chicago also in the mix. The Kentucky Derby will run this year, and the grandstands won't be empty. The race normally draws about 150,000 spectators, but track officials say come September, that's when the event's rescheduled for, capacity will be significantly reduced. Meanwhile, here at home, as more people venture out to dine in for the first time in months, they are finding out a lot has changed. Restaurants across the country are in various stages of reopening, but there are a few things they all have in common no matter where in Canada you live. So, what should you expect?
The first thing they're going to find is that you don't have as many tables and as many seating spaces as you could have had before.
So likely at most 50% occupancy, though some restaurants have gotten a little creative with how they fill that empty space. Tables 6 feet apart. Outdoor dining may be the only option available to you depending on local laws, so just be sure to check beforehand. Then there's the wait staff. You'll notice they're wearing more protective gear than usual, and don't be surprised if they come to your table a little less often. Less contact between you and them is a good thing. Then there's the table itself.
Well, there'll be nothing on the tables. We'll be bringing menus to people, or they can look on their phone to see what the menu is, and then we'll be bringing their cutlery and any condiments.
And you should know that the employees all have to go through a daily check to make sure that they're symptom-free. Thank you very much. Now, you may also be wondering, could you get sick if someone sneezes on the food and then you eat it? Well, there's no easy answer to that, but infection via food seems to be pretty rare, if it happens at all. This is a virus that is principally breathed in by being around other people. If you swallow it or eat it, your stomach acid dissolves it. So here's the bottom line.
Certainly we know that the longer someone has a potential exposure, the greater the risk of getting this infection. But having said that, I mean, if you've already crossed that threshold to go out for dinner, the restaurant's taking steps to really mitigate the risk of bringing infection in and transmitting infection within the restaurant. I think it's okay to enjoy a nice dinner.
Still ahead on the National, Vince Carter says goodbye to basketball.
I don't think you have a record number of Canadians in the NBA, if not for Vince Carter.
His lasting legacy on the Canadian game. But first, it's Thursday, so Rosie's here with that issue.
Adrian, following your interview this week, tonight we're talking about the growing calls for Ottawa to intervene to release the two Michaels and perhaps stop Meng Wanzhou's extradition process. The political response, where this leaves the federal government and those two Canadians. That's next with Chantal, Andrew, and Althea.
The bigger question is whether or not we want China or other countries to get the message that all they have to do to get leverage over the Canadian government is randomly arrest a couple of Canadians.
The Prime Minister today rejected calls to release Meng Wanzhou despite the mounting pressure from a group of former Canadian diplomats and parliamentarians. So what is the political way forward with China? What does this mean for the detained Canadians? It's Thursday, and I'm here with that issue. Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, and Althea Raj. All right, let's start with the Prime Minister's response today. Chantal, it seemed probably the toughest language he has had to date on this issue, although he's been criticized that the language wasn't tough enough before. What did you make of his response?
It's clear that pressures are mounting on the Liberal government to kind of make a deal, a trade-off, in part because of the feeling, I suspect, of the people who signed this letter, that increasingly the two Michaels are at risk, that the accusations of spying and the prospects are becoming increasingly glum. It is also clear that all of those realities do not offer the Trudeau government a proper exit strategy from the line that it has been keeping, which has been that it does not engage in hostage negotiations. And at this point, that is what it had become. A group calling for Canada to engage in hostage trade-offs, and the Prime Minister saying, well, if we do it for this, anyone is going to say Canada's free game, let's just pick anyone and go forward on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that point, Andrew, is well taken. If you do this, if you bend, at what point will some other country try this? And so how do you reckon with that? How does any government reckon with that?
Not just any other country, but also China itself. Yeah. We're not even clear that they would actually yield up the two Michaels if we did intervene and release Meng Wanzhou. The signatories, the 19 signatories, the former Supreme Court Justice and former Minister of Justice who before them had talked about this, they don't really seem to have given a lot of thought, or at least publicly, to the implications that way. Now, they are fair game to say that we should be thinking about the welfare of the two Michaels, and obviously who can contest that. But we also have to think of the welfare of people who might be detained, kidnapped, taken hostage in future, either by China or by other countries. So the precedent argument, I think, is a powerful one. And not only the precedent, not only the implications for Canadians abroad in terms of hostage taking, but also the implications for our extradition system. We have an extradition treaty with the United States and with other countries for good reason, because we want to facilitate the transfer of accused persons between countries, and we want to do so as much as possible within the confines of law and the judicial system and due process, and not as a result of political deals, political pressure, et cetera. So that would also be setting a dangerous and troublesome precedent in that direction as well.
What did you make of what the Prime Minister said today, Althea? Was it the right message for right now?
I think it's the right message for Justin Trudeau to give in order to be consistent with, Justin Trudeau since 2015. Mm-hmm. When you think back about his policy position on paying ransoms, for example, those 2 Canadians who were in the Philippines, he said no. And the reason he said no was because it would just encourage other people to do this. And the same principle applies with what's happening with China. I think the government had hoped that by reaching to international partners, to talking to other partners that have had coercion applied by China against them, like Australia, like Japan, like Korea, that there would be a soft diplomacy option available to them. You could look at the lens where Canada sent 16 tons of personal protective equipment to China when they were grappling with the coronavirus crisis. With that lens, while we have this that is really affecting our relationship, and our trade relationship has also been affected, on the other hand, we're keeping that channel of conversation open. Mm-hmm. And right now, frankly, it looks like their main hope of seeing any movement is that there's a change in the White House come November, and that President Biden decides to play hardball with the Chinese with regards to the 2 Michaels. But I think, just to Andrew's point, I don't think that they didn't think the issue through, these 19 signatories. When you look at people like Robert Fowler, Mr. Fowler, who was kidnapped in Africa and for whom a ransom was paid, though the government publicly denied it. We do know that foreign affairs officials did things for Mr. Fowler that they normally would not do for other citizens. So in some ways, it's entirely consistent with some of the beliefs of the people who signed that letter. And I think it is deeply powerful. I think we would all want the government to do a prisoner swap if it was our loved one in China. But I think, to Andrew's point and to Chantal's point, I think we're all basically saying the same thing. There's a deeper principle at play here, and it is a dangerous one if we cave now.
Chantal wants in there.
I think the government is kind of on a speedway on this, and there was an exit that it was hoping for, and that would have been a ruling by the BC court that would have cast doubt on the extradition demand from the United States. And that would have provided Canada with some cover with the US and the White House, and would also have been consistent with the message that we are guided by the rule of law. That didn't happen. And Justice Holmes did not actually rule in the way that many in the government, I suspect, hoped for. But she also, in the process, shored up the case for going ahead with the extradition. So at this point, having argued for the rule of law and having had a court ruling that says this extradition demand is based on law, it's hard to see how you push on the brakes in the middle of a highway to do a U-turn.
Yes, go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah. There is one part of the letter from the 19 dignitaries that I do agree with, which is that we have many more problems with China than just these 2 hostages. We have a tiger by the tail here. We have a Chinese government, a Chinese dictatorship that is creating problems around the world, is much more aggressive and assertive than it's been in the past, and much more of a problem. And it is true, I think, that we've been pulling our punches on some of these issues because of the 2 hostages. Now, the letter makes this bizarre suggestion that if we cave into China on this, if we capitulate and appease them in this regard, then we can get much tougher with them on other issues. I just don't think that's credible. But I do think it does point to the need that we're going to have to basically make a decision that we're going to confront China on these issues, and we cannot allow the fate of these 2 people, as troublesome as that is, to dictate our foreign policy more generally.
Okay, well, we're going to take a short. I'm going to take a short break if I can, and you can start when we come back, Althea, and we'll talk about that. Where does all of this leave Canada's foreign policy and its relationship with China going forward? That's next, with more of At Issue right after this.
It is certain that this issue of China trying to exert political pressure on Canada by having arbitrarily detained 2 Canadians in response to us fulfilling obligations under an international extradition treaty is causing a challenge in our relationship.
Back for another round of At Issue with Chantal, Andrew, and Althea. Althea, let's pick up where we left off there with what Andrew, Andrew was talking about in terms of foreign policy. The Prime Minister using the word challenging. I think we're probably past the point of being of a challenging relationship with China. But what does it say about the government's overall approach, not only to China, but to foreign policy when we get into nitty-gritty situations like this one?
Well, I just wanted to pick up on Andrew's point, because I think that part of the letter outlines things where these high-ranking diplomats and former parliamentarians, including cabinet ministers, rightfully point is that there are decisions that should have been made a long time ago that the government decided here, not to make because they didn't want to antagonize China. So primarily, of course, is the decision on Huawei. There is no real reason why we still have not publicly said what we should do about allowing Huawei into our 5G network. There are other things that they point to, are silence on what's happening in Hong Kong, but also the concentration camps in China. You know, there are things where the government says it has values, but it has not vocalize them as loud as one would expect them. And you could also see, you know, our Security Council seat campaign in that light, not wanting to antagonize China and its possible influence in Africa, for example. But now that that is done with, I think that there is a real reckoning that has to happen in the Prime Minister's office that our relationship with China is not what the Liberal government once thought or attempted to pursue.
But one of the things that Michael Kovrig's wife said, separated wife, but his wife said is today that if you're not going to do what the letter has proposed and you're not going to do what we're saying, what are you going to do? And is that not the stage that we're at here, Chantal, where if you're not willing to do one thing, you cannot just sit and wait for something to happen?
Well, that's really interesting because I've read it in a number of commentaries, but I'm still waiting to see what that something is. That's easy to say, then you're going to have to do something. I suspect at this point that the something is to wait for the outcome of the American election and the maybe more serene or more comprehensive conversation with an administration in the U.S. And that goes to the crafting of our foreign policy, including on China. We are not in this debate because of some foreign policy move. We are in this because of some moves by the Trump administration. Yeah. And we do not craft the world's response to China alone. So I think between now and November, it will still be a wait-and-see period.
Last word to you, Andrew.
There's something to be said in politics for delaying. When there's time, there's hope. I also think, though, that what the Prime Minister's statements today may signal is that a realization that there's little to be lost from a tougher stance with China, not just on the two Michaels, but on this broader foreign policy agenda, that the nicely, softly approach does not seem to have ameliorated them, does not seem to have brought them around at all. And that maybe some tougher measures, Magnitsky-style sanctions, for example, or shifts in foreign policy with regard to Taiwan, that these kinds of things may start to become in order now.
Okay, good conversation. Thank you all very much for weighing in. Before we go, be sure to subscribe to At Issue, the podcast. Look for it on any major podcast app and our website, cbcnews.ca/The National. For now, though, back to Adrian and Andrew in Toronto.
Thanks very much, Rosie. Much more ahead on The National. But first, we want to turn to Lives Remembered. That's the CBC News project aiming to tell the stories of those people Canada has lost to COVID-19. Mohammed Bayat tells us about his father, Hussein.
My name is Mohammed Bayat. I lost my father to COVID-19 on April 13, 2020. He was 83. Hussein Bayat was a much-loved family man, educator, and humanitarian. He believed that anyone, no matter how humble their beginnings, could create a positive impact on the world. Dad was born in 1937 in a small village in Gujarat, India, and came to Canada in 1967 with the passionate belief that education was life's great equalizer. He served for nearly 40 years in Nova Scotia's public school system. As a teacher, he was renowned for his endless patience and willingness to help his students succeed. He was my teacher in grade 7, and my friends would routinely call or come by to ask him for help with homework or prep for a test. But when I asked for help, he refused. He didn't want me to have an unfair advantage. Dad's passion for education and fairness had no boundaries. When he retired, he focused his energy into building and supporting schools, healthcare, and clean water projects in Canada and all over the world. 72 projects in all at the end. Regardless of color or creed, Dad wanted everyone to have a fair shake in life. Until he got sick with the coronavirus, he'd be out 10 to 12 hours a day, meeting with different people, trying to raise money for all these different projects. He was in his 80s and we'd constantly battle with him to stop and rest. And he'd say, you only live once and you have to make a difference and you have to help people. Dad, I never got to see you in the hospital during your last days. I was in the car seeing you on FaceTime. I'll always remember and cherish the time we spent in India earlier this year. Thank you for showing me all the charitable projects that you were working on. I love you so much. I miss you, and I hope to carry on your legacy.
Hussein Bayat, one of more than 8,500 Canadians lost to COVID-19. If you've also lost someone and you want to share their story, you can reach out to us, covid@cbc.ca.
The We Want Vince chants continue.
Even on the verge of a suspended NBA season, fans were chanting his name, and Vince Carter didn't disappoint.
They're going to give it to Vince. He's going to take a three and hit it.
That shot came on a night in March when questions were swirling about the impact of COVID-19 on the league, but also about the future of the former Raptor. Many suspected it would be his final year on the court. Well, today he made that official. Cameron McIntosh looks back at a storied career.
Carter.
It's still impressive. Vince Carter's performance in the 2000 NBA dunk competition didn't just blow away Shaq. It made a whole country say, that's our guy. It's why Amir Remzi plays today.
He helped me transition from soccer to basketball. And now it's like basketball is first for me.
The 90s growing up, that was when, the Raptors started. And I remember everybody had the gear. Some people were kind of mocking the logo a little bit. People were kind of unsure, but of course he came in and he legitimized everything.
Carter played 22 seasons, longer than any other, the first to play in 4 separate decades. Today, he said he knew he made his last shot when COVID cut the NBA season short.
I'm officially finished playing basketball. Making my last shot helped the situation, because I think, honestly, if I didn't make my last shot, it'd have been a little different.
He never did win a ring, but it's those 6 seasons in Toronto where he made his mark, and not just the dunks.
His imprint is still all over it from a Canadian perspective.
Analyst Donovan Bennett says Carter inspired a whole generation of Canadian talent.
I don't think you have a record number of Canadians in the NBA. I don't think you have back-to-back high draft picks coming out of Toronto specifically, if not for Vince Carter.
There's also a legitimate argument if Carter wasn't doing this in 2000, Kawhi Leonard wouldn't have done this in 2019.
If we didn't have Carter during that time, I'm not certain the Raptors would have been a viable product going forward.
Carter left Toronto in 2004 on bad terms. Time heals.
We had a lot of American guys that we could look to as the superstars, but now to finally have one of our own, that was really great.
Not only did he put us on the map, but he really changed basketball and the culture in the city.
A question to ponder now, will Carter's number 15 one day hang in Toronto? Cameron McIntosh, CBC News, Winnipeg.
Okay, well, an Ontario dad has figured out a way to take a family trip to PEI without bursting the Atlantic bubble.
Of all of the homes in Canada, that would probably be the most recognizable.
A trip to Green Gables in the backyard. Next. Remember this center block bed an Ottawa dad built for his daughter back in the fall? Well, he's done it again, except this time it is a miniature Anne of Green Gables playhouse. Robert Coleman's creative spin on a timeless Canadian classic is our moment tonight.
I wanted to build a playhouse for my kids in the backyard. And I had a couple of plans that I'd sent away for, just sort of generic playhouses. Then I thought, well, it's a house, I should think of some kind of uniquely Canadian house that I could base it on. And I don't know, Green Gables just kind of floated into my head. We have a couple of Anne of Green Gables books and things for my daughter who's 3 that we read to her, and so it kind of worked. And I figured of all of the homes in Canada, that would probably be the most recognizable one. I spent about 2 months sort of putting it all together, and I put the finishing touches of paint on yesterday. I like to do fun things, and my kids are pretty excited about it. At least the 3-year-old is. My daughter is definitely into Anne of Green Gables, and she's been watching Anne with an E with my wife, and now she's obsessed with her little Anne house.
So how's that for a pandemic project? Hey, you started just a few months ago and looking pretty good.
Mad respect for him. I actually have a little project for you, Andrew. Consider this maybe early warning to kind of tidy up in there. Maybe get your papers off my side of the desk, because come Monday, I'm coming back in.
No, you know what? I don't know. I don't know if there's room. I've gotten used to
we'll talk.
kind of spreading out.
We'll talk. I'm going to end. That's a national for Thursday, June 25th. Good night.
Can't wait to see you again. Good night.